Welcome to the Bits of Good Bootcamp. In this video, we're going to talk about composition and inheritance in React. So inheritance is something that y'all are probably pretty familiar with if you've done any kind of object-oriented programming in Java or Python, and inheritance works really well in those programming languages if you're going with an object-oriented paradigm. However, composition is actually React's preferred way of reusing code between components. And in general, the difference between inheritance and composition, if I had to really briefly describe it, inheritance is when you're taking another class and you're extending it. And composition is where instead of extending a class, what you're going to do is really just create an instance of that class inside of your class. So you're putting it inside of yourself without actually extending it. So it allows you to use the other class without actually extending it. And composition is React's preferred way of doing code reuse. And so we're going to step through just a couple of quick things about using composition in React. So one way of using composition is something called containment. And the idea is that some components don't actually know what their children are going to be ahead of time. And so this is especially common for some components that represent more like generic boxes. So an example might be like a sidebar or a dialog where you have some formatting for the outside of the box, so to speak, but you don't really know or care really about what's going to be inside. And so one way to deal with these types of situations is to use a special prop that React provides you, which is called props.children. And props.children essentially passes any children elements directly into, it passes children directly as a prop. And so here, this lets components arbitrarily pass children to components by nesting them in JSX. And I know that's a little confusing, so I think the easiest way to illustrate is just an example. And so you see here fancy borders. So this is what we might call like our generic box component. And fancy borders here is really just going to be putting a border of a certain color around whatever the props.children is. And so really what you see here is welcome dialog is an example of fancy borders where what we're passing inside of it is this. This stuff is in between the opening fancy borders and the closing fancy borders components. And so this is referred to as its children. And essentially anything that gets passed between the fancy borders JSX tags gets passed to the fancy borders components as props.children. And so that's why you can see here that I labeled this props.children. I think this example makes a little bit more sense in explaining what it is. And we can just take a second here and look at the code pen to make sure that it works as we expect. And as we expect, we see that our fancy borders here is being passed in the color blue, and so we have a blue border. And the things that were inside of the JSX opening and closing tags for the fancy borders are being rendered as props.children inside. And so I could also pass in another thing just for the sake of testing. Testing Andre was here. And we should see that this is also included inside. So really anything that we want to use props.children for, props.children is all of these, but that doesn't mean that we can't put other things inside as well. Alright, so that's that example. I'll leave this page. And another thing that we might want to do is specialization. And so here we're taking a slightly different approach, and what we're doing is we're realizing that sometimes components are really special cases of other components. So for example here, welcome dialog is really just a more specific type of dialog. Nothing really is changing other than the props. And so what we can do is actually encompass dialog inside of another component, which we're calling welcome dialog, and we'll just render the dialog component with some predefined props. And so this allows us to make more specific specialized components. And here we can also check the code pen. Oh, I missed the code pen link. All right, here, let's check the code pen. Just to make sure that this works as we expect. And as you can see, it does. So we could, just for the sake of testing, we could make another component, another specialized component. So I'm going to call this one bye dialog. This is going to say goodbye. And yeah, thanks for visiting. We can leave that part the same. And so I'll change this, and we'll see that it changes to goodbye. So this is just another example of how we could make a specialized component that is really just modifying the props of another component. Okay, next. We can also just see here that composition works just as well with classes. So here we have the same kind of approach where we're making a more specialized dialog, and we have our original dialog here, and we're just passing this in, and this is a more complicated class component that's keeping some internal state. But really, the dialog container doesn't care that it's being used as part of this composition. And we can also see that there's actually some props.children action going on in here as well. But we're not going to go into this code peddling. This just serves to illustrate that you can use composition with both classes and functional component. And then you might be asking, so what about inheritance? And so I got this right from the React docs, and it says, at Facebook we use React in thousands of components, and we haven't found any use cases where we would recommend creating component inheritance hierarchies. And really, I think that should suffice to say that Facebook has been using React for a long time, and if they haven't found a good reason to use inheritance in React, it probably is not a good idea, and you shouldn't go above and try to prove Facebook wrong and find a situation where it's a good idea to use inheritance. Just kind of accept it. In general, props and composition give you all the flexibility that you need. Really the fact that with components they can accept any types of props. It can be primitives, it can be other React elements, it can even be functions, it can be objects, it could be anything. This gives you all the flexibility you need to build all types of really powerful and dynamic web applications. Alright, thanks. That's it for this video. See you in the next video.